and that all virtue is most rewarded and all wickedness most punished in itself, according as the poet saith excellently, The Advancement of Learning by Francis Bacon, Part 4 out of 5. Hath neither been well judged of, nor well inquired, for the good of fruition or contentment is placed either in the sincereness of the fruition, or in the quickness and vigor of it, the one superinduced by equality, the other by vicissitude, the one having less mixture of evil, the other more impression of good. Whether of these is the greater good is a question controverted, but whether man's nature may not be capable of both is a question not inquired. For the former question being debated between Socrates and a sophist, Socrates placing felicity in an equal and constant peace of mind, and the sophist in much desiring and much enjoying, they fell from argument to ill words, the sophist saying that Socrates' felicity was the felicity of a block or stone, and Socrates saying that the sophist's felicity was the felicity of one that had the itch, who did nothing but itch and scratch. And both these opinions do not want their supports, for the opinion of Socrates is much upheld by the general consent even of the epicures themselves, that virtue beareth a great part in felicity, and, if so, certain it is, that virtue hath more use in clearing perturbations than in compassing desires. The sophist's opinion is much favored by the assertion we last spake of, that good of advancement is greater than good of simple preservation, because every obtaining a desire hath a show of advancement, as motion though in a circle hath a show of progression. 5. But the second question, decided the true way, maketh the former superfluous. For can it be doubted, but that there are some who take more pleasure in enjoying pleasures than some other, and yet, nevertheless, are less troubled with the loss or leaving of them, so as this same non uti ut non appetis. Non appeter ut non metuas sunt animi pusili et diffidentes. And it seemeth to me that most of the doctrines of the philosophers are more fearful and cautious than the nature of things requireth. So have they increased the fear of death in offering to cure it. For when they would have a man's whole life to be but a discipline or preparation to die, they must needs make men think that it is a terrible enemy, against whom there is no end of preparing. Better saith the poet, Qui finem viti extremum intermunere opponat naturi. So have they sought to make men's minds too uniform and harmonical, by not breaking them sufficiently to contrary motions. The reasons whereof I suppose to be, because they themselves were men dedicated to a private, free and unapplied course of life. For as we see, upon the lute or like instrument, a ground, though it be sweet, and have show of many changes, yet breaketh not the hand to such strange and hard stops and passages, as a set song or voluntary. Much after the same manner was the diversity between a philosophical and civil life. And therefore men are to imitate the wisdom of jewelers, who, if there be a grain, or a cloud, or an ice which may be ground forth without taking too much of the stone, they help it, but if it should lessen and abate the stone too much, they will not meddle with it. So ought men so to procure serenity as they destroy not magnanimity. 6. Having therefore deduced the good of man which is private and particular, as far as seemeth fit, We will now return to that good of man which respecteth and beholdeth society, which we may term duty, because the term of duty is more proper to a mind well framed and disposed towards others, as the term of virtue is applied to a mind well formed and composed in itself, though neither can a man understand virtue without some relation to society, nor duty without an inward disposition. This part may seem at first to pertain to science civil and politic, but not if it be well observed, for it concerneth the regiment and government of every man over himself, not over others, and as in architecture the direction of framing the posts, beams, and other parts of building is not the same with the manner of joining them and erecting the building, and in mechanicals, the direction how to frame an instrument or engine is not the same with the manner of setting it on work and employing it. And yet, nevertheless, in expressing of the one you incidentally express the aptness towards the other. So the doctrine of conjugation of men in society differeth from that of their conformity thereunto. 7. This part of duty is subdivided into two parts: the common duty of every man, as a man or member of a state; the other, the respective or special duty of every man in his profession, vocation, and place. The first of these is extant and well labored, as hath been said. The second likewise I may report rather dispersed than deficient, which manner of dispersed writing in this kind of argument I acknowledge to be best. For who can take upon him to write of the proper duty, virtue, challenge, and right of every several vocation, profession, and place? For although sometimes a looker on may see more than a gamester, and there be a proverb more arrogant than sound, that the veil best discovereth the hill, yet there is small doubt but that men can write best and most really and materially in their own professions, and that the writing of speculative men of active matter for the most part doth seem to men of experience, as Phormio's argument of the wars seemed to Hannibal to be but dreams and dotage. Only there is one vice which accompanieth them that write in their own professions, that they magnify them in excess. But generally it were to be wished as that which would make learning indeed solid and fruitful, that active men would or could become writers. 8. In which kind I cannot but mention Honoris Causa, your Majesty's excellent book touching the duty of a king, a work richly compounded of divinity, morality, and policy, with great aspersion of all other arts, and being in some opinion one of the most sound and healthful writings that I have read, not distempered in the heat of invention, nor in the coldness of negligence, not sick of dizziness, as those are who lease themselves in their order, nor of convulsions, as those which cramp in matters impertinent, not savouring of perfumes and paintings, as those do who seek to please the reader more than nature beareth, and chiefly well disposed in the spirits thereof, being agreeable to truth and apt for action, and far removed from that natural infirmity whereunto I noted those that write in their own professions to be subject, which is, that they exalt it above measure. For your Majesty hath truly described, not a king of Assyria or Persia in their extern glory, but a Moses or a David, pastors of their people. Neither can I ever lease out of my remembrance what I heard your Majesty in the same sacred spirit of government deliver in a great cause of judicature, which was that kings ruled by their laws, as God did by the laws of nature, and ought as rarely to put in use their supreme prerogative as God doth his power of working miracles. And yet, notwithstanding in your book of a free monarchy, you do well give men to understand that you know the plenitude of the power and right of a king, as well as the circle of his office and duty. Thus have I presumed to allege this excellent writing of your Majesty as a prime or eminent example of tractates concerning special and respective duties, wherein I should have said as much if it had been written 1,000 years since. Neither am I moved with certain courtly decencies, which esteem it flattery to praise in presence. No, it is flattery to praise in absence, that is, when either the virtue is absent, or the occasion is absent. And so the praise is not natural, but forced, either in truth or in time. But let Cicero be read in his oration Pro Marcello, which is nothing but an excellent table of Caesar's virtue, and made to his face, besides the example of many other excellent persons, wiser a great deal than such observers. And we will never doubt, upon a full occasion, to give just praises to present or absent. 9. But to return, there belongeth further to the handling of this part, touching the duties of professions and vocations, a relative or opposite, touching the frauds, cautels, impostures, and vices of every profession, which hath been likewise handled. But how rather in a satire and cynically, than seriously and wisely, for men have rather sought by wit to deride and traduce much of that which is good in professions, than with judgment to discover and sever that which is corrupt. For, as Solomon saith, but no matter for his instruction, querenti dirissari scientiam ipsa si abscondit, sed studioso fit obvium. But the managing of this argument with integrity and truth, which I note as deficient, seemeth to me to be one of the best fortifications for honesty and virtue that can be planted. For, as the fable goeth of the basilisk, that if he see you first, you die for it, but if you see him first, he dieth, so is it with deceits and evil arts, which, if they be first espied, they lease their life. But if they prevent, they endanger, so that we are much beholden to Machiavel and others, that write what men do, and not what they ought to do, for it is not possible to join serpentine wisdom with the columbine innocency, except men know exactly all the conditions of the serpent, his baseness and going upon his belly, his volubility and lubricity, his envy and sting, and the rest, that is, all forms and natures of evil. For without this, virtue lieth open and unfenced, nay, an honest man can do no good upon those that are wicked. To reclaim them, without the help of the knowledge of evil. For men of corrupted minds presuppose that honesty groweth out of simplicity of manners, and believing of preachers, schoolmasters, and men's exterior language, so as, except you can make them perceive that you know the utmost reaches of their own corrupt opinions, they despise all morality. Non recipit stultus verba prudentiae, nisi dixeris qui versantur in cord ejus. 10 Unto this part, touching respective duty, doth also appertain the duties between husband and wife, parent and child, master and servant. So likewise the laws of friendship and gratitude, the civil bond of companies, colleges and politic bodies of neighborhood, and all other proportionate duties, not as they are parts of government and society, but as to the framing of the mind of particular persons. 11 The knowledge concerning good respecting society doth handle it also, not simply alone, but comparatively, whereunto belongeth the weighing of duties between person and person, case and case, particular and public. As we see in the proceeding of Lucius Brutus against his own sons, which was so much extolled, yet what was said in Felix a concurrenti fatum minors, so the case was doubtful, and had opinion on both sides. Again, we see when M. Brutus and Cassius invited to a supper certain whose opinions they meant to feel, whether they were fit to be made their associates, and cast forth the question touching the killing of a tyrant being a usurper. They were divided in opinion, some holding that servitude was the extreme of evils, and others that tyranny was better than a civil war, and a number of the like cases there are of comparative duty, amongst which that of all others is the most frequent, where the question is of a great deal of good to ensue of a small injustice, which Jason of Thessalia determined against the truth. Aliqua sunt injust facendo, ut multa just feri passant. But the reply is good. Auctorum praesentes justici habes, sponsorum futuri non habes. Men must pursue things which are just in present, and leave the future to the divine providence. So then we pass on from this general part touching the exemplar and description of good. Romans 22:1 Now, therefore, that we have spoken of this fruit of life, it remaineth to speak of the husbandry that belongeth thereunto, without which part the former seemeth to be no better than a fair image or statue, which is beautiful to contemplate, but is without life and motion, whereunto Aristotle himself subscribeth in these words, Nessus est silicit de virtute dicer. Et quid sit, et ex quibus gig nature, inutile enum fear fuerit virtutum quidem nas, acquirendi autem ejus modos et vias ignorare. Non enum de virtute tantum, quas specie sit, querendum est, sed et quamodo sui copium facit, atrunc enum volumius, et rem ipsum nas, et ejus compotes furii, hoc autem ex voto non succedit, nisi sciamus et ex quibus et quamodo. In such full words, and with such iteration doth he inculcate this part. So saith Cicero in great commendation of Cato II, that he had applied himself to philosophy, non ita disputandi causa, sed ita vivendi. And although the neglect of our times, wherein few men do hold any consultations touching the reformation of their life, as Seneca excellently saith, de partibus viti quisque deliberat, de summa nemo, may make this part seem superfluous. Yet I must conclude with that aphorism of Hippocrates, qui gravi morbo correpti doloris non sentiunt, iis mens egrotat. They need medicine, not only to assuage the disease, but to awake the sense. And if it be said, that the cure of men's minds belongeth to sacred divinity, it is most true. But yet moral philosophy may be preferred unto her as a wise servant and humble handmaid. For as the Psalm saith, that the eyes of the handmaid look perpetually towards the mistress, and yet no doubt many things are left to the discretion of the handmaid, to discern of the mistress' will. So ought moral philosophy to give a constant attention to the doctrines of divinity, and yet so as it may yield of herself within due limits many sound and profitable directions. To this part, therefore, because of the excellency thereof, I cannot but find exceeding strange that it is not reduced to written inquiry, the rather because it consisteth of much matter, wherein both speech and action is often conversant, and such wherein the common talk of men which is rare, but yet cometh sometimes to pass is wiser than their books. It is reasonable, therefore, that we propound it in the more particularity, both for the worthiness, and because we may acquit ourselves for reporting it deficient, which seemeth almost incredible, and is otherwise conceived and presupposed by those themselves that have written. We will, therefore, enumerate some heads or points thereof, that it may appear the better what it is, and whether it be extant. 3. First, therefore, in this, as in all things which are practical, we ought to cast up our account, what is in our power, and what not, for the one may be dealt with by way of alteration, but the other by way of application only. The husbandman cannot command neither the nature of the earth, nor the seasons of the weather. No more can the physician the constitution of the patient, nor the variety of accidents. So in the culture and cure of the mind of man, two things are without our command, points of nature and points of fortune. For to the basis of the one, and the conditions of the other, our work is limited and tied. In these things, therefore, it is left unto us to proceed by application. Vincendet est omnis fortuna ferendo, and so likewise. Vincendet est omnis natura ferendo, but when that we speak of suffering, we do not speak of a dull and neglected suffering, but of a wise and industrious suffering, which draweth and contriveth use and advantage out of that which seemeth adverse and contrary, which is that properly which we call accommodating or applying. Now the wisdom of application resteth principally in the exact and distinct knowledge of the precedent state or disposition, unto which we do apply, for we cannot fit a garment except we first take measure of the body. For so, then, the first article of this knowledge is to set down sound and true distributions and descriptions of the several characters and tempers of men's natures and dispositions, specially having regard to those differences which are most radical in being the fountains and causes of the rest, or most frequent in concurrence or commixture, wherein it is not the handling of a few of them in passage, the better to describe the mediocrities of virtues that can satisfy this intention. For, if it deserve to be considered, that there are minds which are proportioned to great matters, and others to small which Aristotle handleth, or ought to have bandied, by the name of magnanimity, doth it not deserve as well to be considered that there are minds proportioned to intend many matters, and others to few, so that some can divide themselves, others can perchance do exactly well, but it must be but in few things at once. and so there cometh to be a narrowness of mind, as well as a pusillanimity. And again, that some minds are proportioned to that which may be dispatched at once, or within a short return of time; others to that which begins afar off, and is to be won with length of pursuit. Jam tum tendix fovk, so that there may be fitly said to be a longanimity, which is commonly also ascribed to God as a magnanimity. So further deserved it to be considered by Aristotle, that there is a disposition in conversation, supposing it in things which do in no sort touch or concern a man's self to soothe and please, and a disposition contrary to contradict and cross, and deserveth it not much better to be considered, that there is a disposition, not in conversation or talk, but in matter of more serious nature, and supposing it still in things merely indifferent, to take pleasure in the good of another, and a disposition contrariwise to take distaste at the good of another, which is that properly which we call good nature or ill nature, benignity or malignity. And therefore I cannot sufficiently marvel that this part of knowledge, touching the several characters of natures and dispositions, should be omitted both in morality and policy, considering it is of so great ministry and supeditation to them both. A man shall find in the traditions of astrology some pretty and apt divisions of men's natures, according to the predominances of the planets: lovers of quiet, lovers of action, lovers of victory, lovers of honor, lovers of pleasure, lovers of arts, lovers of change, and so forth. A man shall find in the wisest sort of these relations which the Italians make touching conclaves, the natures of the several cardinals handsomely and lively painted forth. A man shall meet with in every day's conference the denominations of sensitive, dry, formal, real, humorous, certain, uomo di prima impression, uomo di ultima impression, and the like. And yet, nevertheless, this kind of observations wandereth in words, but is not fixed in inquiry. For the distinctions are found many of them, but we conclude no precepts upon them, wherein our fault is the greater. Because both history, poesy, and daily experience are as goodly fields where these observations grow, whereof we make a few poses to hold in our hands, but no man bringeth them to the confectionery, that receipts might be made of them for use of life. 5 of much like kind are those impressions of nature, which are imposed upon the mind by the sex, by the age, by the region, by health and sickness, by beauty and deformity, and the like, which are inherent and not extern. And again, those which are caused by extern fortune, as sovereignty, nobility, obscure birth, riches, want, magistracy, privateness, prosperity, adversity, constant fortune, variable fortune, rising per saltum, per gradus, and the like. And therefore we see that Plautus maketh it a wonder to see an old man beneficent. Benignitas hugis ad adolescentuli est. St. Paul concludeth that severity of discipline was to be used to the Cretans. Increpidios dur, upon the disposition of their country, Cretensis semper mendaces mali besci venters. Sallust noteth that it is usual with kings to desire contradictories, sed plerunc rigii voluntates, ut vehemens sunt sic mobiles, si pec ipsi sibi advers. Tacitus observeth how rarely raising of the fortune mendeth the disposition, solus Vespasianus mutatis in melius. Pindarus maketh an observation, that great and sudden fortune for the most part defeateth men qui magnam felicitatem concaquor non passant. So the song showeth it is more easy to keep a measure in the enjoying of fortune, than in the increase of fortune. Divici si affluent, nolite cor opponer. These observations and the like I deny not, but are touched a little by Aristotle as in passage in his Rhetorics, and are handled in some scattered discourses, but they were never incorporate into moral philosophy, to which they do essentially appertain. As the knowledge of this diversity of grounds and molds doth to agriculture, and the knowledge of the diversity of complexions and constitutions doth to the physician, except we mean to follow the indiscretion of empirics, which minister the same medicines to all patients. 6. Another article of this knowledge is the inquiry touching the affections, for, as in medicining of the body, it is in order first to know the divers complexions and constitutions, secondly the diseases, and lastly the cures. So in medicining of the mind, after knowledge of the divers characters of men's natures, it followeth in order to know the diseases and infirmities of the mind, which are no other than the perturbations and distempers of the affections. For as the ancient politiques in popular estates were wont to compare the people to the sea, and the orators to the winds, because as the sea would of itself be calm and quiet, if the winds did not move and trouble it, so the people would be peaceable and tractable if the seditious orators did not set them in working and agitation. So it may be fitly said, that the mind in the nature thereof would be temperate and staid if the affections, as winds, did not put it into tumult and perturbation. And here again I find strange, as before, that Aristotle should have written divers volumes of ethics, and never handled the affections, which is the principal subject thereof, and yet in his Rhetorics, where they are considered but collaterally and in a second degree as they may be moved by speech, he findeth place for them, and handleth them well for the quantity, but where their true place is he pretermiteth them. For it is not his disputations about pleasure and pain that can satisfy this inquiry, no more than he that should generally handle the nature of light can be said to handle the nature of colors. For pleasure and pain are to the particular affections as light is to particular colors. Better travails, I suppose, had the Stoics taken in this argument, as far as I can gather by that which we have at second hand. But yet it is like it was after their manner, rather in subtlety of definitions, which in a subject of this nature are but curiosities, than in active and ample descriptions and observations. So likewise I find some particular writings of an elegant nature, touching some of the affections, as of anger, of comfort upon adverse accidents, of tenderness of countenance, and other. But the poets and writers of histories are the best doctors of this knowledge, where we may find painted forth, with great life, how affections are kindled and incited, and how pacified and refrained, and how again contained from act and further degree, how they disclose themselves, how they work, how they vary, how they gather and fortify, how they are enwrapped one within another, and how they do fight and encounter one with another, and other the like particularities, amongst the which this last is of special use in moral and civil matters, how, I say, to set affection against affection, and to master one by another, even as we used to hunt beast with beast, and fly bird with bird, which otherwise per case we could not so easily recover, upon which foundation is erected that excellent use of premium and pena, whereby civil states consist, employing the predominant affections of fear and hope. For as in the government of states it is sometimes necessary to bridle one faction with another, so it is in the government within. 7. Now come we to those points which are within our own command, and have force and operation upon the mind, to affect the will and appetite, and to alter manners, wherein they ought to have handled custom, exercise, habit, education, example, imitation, emulation, company, friends, praise, reproof, exhortation, fame, laws, books, studies, these as they have determinate use in moralities. From these the mind suffereth, and of these are such receipts and regiments compounded and described, as may serve to recover or preserve the health and good estate of the mind. As far as pertaineth to human medicine, of which number we will insist upon some one or two, as an example of the rest, because it were too long to prosecute all, and therefore we do resume custom and habit to speak of. 8. The opinion of Aristotle seemeth to me a negligent opinion, that of those things which consist by nature, nothing can be changed by custom, using for example, that if a stone be thrown 10,000 times up it will not learn to ascend, and that by often seeing or hearing we do not learn to see or hear the better. For though this principle be true in things wherein nature is peremptory, the reason whereof we cannot now stand to discuss, yet it is otherwise in things wherein nature admitteth a latitude. For he might see that a straight glove will come more easily on with use, and that a wand will by use bend otherwise than it grew, and that by use of the voice we speak louder and stronger, and that by use of enduring heat or cold we endure it the better, and the like, which latter sort have a nearer resemblance unto that subject of manners he handleth, than those instances which he allegeth. But allowing his conclusion, that virtues and vices consist in habit, he ought so much the more to have taught the manner of superinducing that habit, as there is of ordering the exercises of the body, whereof we will recite a few. 9. The first shall be, that we beware we take not at the first either too high a strain or too weak, for if too high, in a diffident nature you discourage, in a confident nature you breed an opinion of facility, and so a sloth, and in all natures you breed a further expectation than can hold out, and so an insatisfaction in the end if too weak. Of the other side, you may not look to perform and overcome any great task. 10. Another precept is to practice all things chiefly at two several times, the one when the mind is best disposed, the other when it is worst disposed, that by the one you may gain a great step, by the other you may work out the knots and stones of the mind, and make the middle times the more easy and pleasant. 11. Another precept is that which Aristotle mentioneth by the way, which is to bear ever towards the contrary extreme of that whereunto we are by nature inclined, like unto the rowing against the stream, or making a wand straight by bending him contrary to his natural crookedness. 12. Another precept is that the mind is brought to anything better, and with more sweetness and happiness, if that whereunto you pretend be not first in the intention, but tanquam aliud agendo, because of the natural hatred of the mind against necessity and constraint. Many other axioms there are touching the managing of exercise and custom, which being so conducted doth prove indeed another nature, but, being governed by chance, doth commonly prove but an ape of nature, and bringeth forth that which is lame and counterfeit. 13. So, if we should handle books and studies, and what influence and operation they have upon manners, are there not divers precepts of great caution and direction appertaining thereunto? Did not one of the fathers in great indignation call posse vinum daemonum, because it increaseth temptations, perturbations, and vain opinions? Is not the opinion of Aristotle worthy to be regarded, wherein he saith that young men are no fit auditors of moral philosophy, because they are not settled from the boiling heat of their affections, nor attempered with time and experience? And doth it not hereof come, that those excellent books and discourses of the ancient writers, whereby they have persuaded unto virtue most effectually, by representing her in state and majesty, and popular opinions against virtue in their parasites coats fit to be scorned and derided, are of so little effect towards honesty of life, because they are not read and revolved by men in their mature and settled years, but confined almost to boys and beginners. But is it not true also, that much less young men are fit auditors of matters of policy, till they have been thoroughly seasoned in religion and morality, lest their judgments be corrupted, and made apt to think that there are no true differences of things, but according to utility and fortune, as the verse describes it, prosperum et felix celis virtus vocatur. And again, ille crucem pretium celeris tulit, hic diadema, which the poets do speak satirically and in indignation on virtue's behalf. But books of policy do speak it seriously and positively, for so it pleaseth Machiavel to say, that if Caesar had been overthrown, he would have been more odious than ever was Catiline, as if there had been no difference but in fortune between a very fury of lust and blood, and the most excellent spirit his ambition reserved of the world. Again, is there not a caution likewise to be given of the doctrines of moralities themselves, some kinds of them, lest they make men too precise, arrogant, incompatible, as Cicero saith of Cato, in Marco Catone hic bona qui vidmis divina et egregia. Ipsius citot est propria qui nonunquam requirimus sunt omnia nona natura, sed in magistro. Many other axioms and advices there are touching those proprieties and effects which studies do infuse and instill into manners. And so, likewise, is there touching the use of all those other points of company, fame, laws, and the rest, which we recited in the beginning in the doctrine of morality. 14. But there is a kind of culture of the mind that seemeth yet more accurate and elaborate than the rest, and is built upon this ground, that the minds of all men are at some times in a state more perfect, and at other times in a state more depraved. The purpose, therefore, of this practice is to fix and cherish the good hours of the mind, and to obliterate and take forth the evil. The fixing of the good hath been practiced by two means, vows or constant resolutions, and observances or exercises, which are not to be regarded so much in themselves, as because they keep the mind in continual obedience. The obliteration of the evil hath been practiced by two means, some kind of redemption or expiation of that which is past, and an inception, or account de novo for the time to come. But this part seemeth sacred and religious and justly, for all good moral philosophy, as was said, is but a handmaid to religion. 15. Wherefore we will conclude with that last point, which is of all other means the most compendious and summary, and again the most noble and effectual to the reducing of the mind unto virtue and good estate, which is the electing and propounding unto a man's self good and virtuous ends of his life, such as may be in a reasonable sort within his compass to attain. For if these two things be supposed, that a man set before him honest and good ends, and again, that he be resolute, constant, and true unto them, it will follow that he shall mold himself into all virtue at once. And this indeed is like the work of nature, whereas the other course is like the work of the hand. For, as when a carver makes an image, he shapes only that part whereupon he worketh, as if he be upon the face, that part which shall be the body is but a rude stone still, till such times as he comes to it. But contrariwise, when nature makes a flower or living creature, she formeth rudiments of all the parts at one time. So in obtaining virtue by habit, while a man practiseth temperance, he doth not profit much to fortitude, nor the like, but when he dedicateth and applieth himself to good ends, look, what virtue soever the pursuit and passage towards those ends doth commend unto him, he is invested of a precedent disposition to conform himself thereunto. Which state of mind Aristotle doth excellently express himself, that it ought not to be called virtuous, but divine. His words are these: Immanitati autem consentinium est opponer qui supra humanitatem est. Heroicam sive divinam virtutum, and a little after, nam ut feri nec vitium nec virtus est, swic nec de, sed hic quidem status altius quidem virtut est. Ille aluit quidem a vitio, and therefore we may see what celsitude of honor Plinius Secundus attributeth to Trajan in his funeral oration, where he said that men needed to make no other prayers to the gods, but that they would continue as good lords to them as Trajan had been, as if he had not been only an imitation of divine nature, but a pattern of it. But these be heathen and profane passages, having but a shadow of that divine state of mind, which religion and the holy faith doth conduct men unto, by imprinting upon their souls charity, which is excellently called the bond of perfection, because it comprehendeth and fasteneth all virtues together. And as it is elegantly said by Menander of vain love, which is but a false imitation of divine love, amor melior sophista lovo et humanum vitam, that love teacheth a man to carry himself better than the sophist or preceptor, which he calleth left-handed, because with all his rules and perceptions, He cannot form a man so dexterously, nor with that facility to prize himself and govern himself, as love can do so certainly, if a man's mind be truly inflamed with charity. It doth work him suddenly into greater perfection than all the doctrine of morality can do, which is but a sophist in comparison of the other. Nay, further, as Xenophon observed truly, that all other affections, though they raise the mind, yet they do it by distorting and uncomeliness of ecstasies or excesses. But only love doth exalt the mind, and nevertheless at the same instant doth settle and compose it, so in all other excellences. Though they advance nature, yet they are subject to excess. Only charity admitteth no excess. For so we see, aspiring to be like God in power, the angels transgressed and fell. Ascendum, et iro similis altissimo, by aspiring to be like God in knowledge, man transgressed and fell. Eritis sicut dii, science bonum et malum, but by aspiring to a similitude of God in goodness or love, neither man nor angel ever transgressed, or shall transgress. For unto that imitation we are called, diligite inimicos vestros, benefacite eis qui oderunt vos, et orate pro persequentibus et calumniantibus vos. Ut citus filii patris vestri qui in celis est, qui solum suum oriere facit super bonos et malos, et pluit super justos et injustos. So in the first platform of the divine nature itself, the heathen religion speaketh thus, Optimus Maximus, and the sacred scriptures thus, Misericordia ejus super omnia opera ejus. 16. Wherefore I do conclude this part of moral knowledge, concerning the culture and regiment of the mind, wherein if any man, considering the arts thereof which I have enumerated, do judge that my labor is but to collect into an art or science that which hath been pretermitted by others, as matter of common sense and experience, he judge it well. But as Philocrates sported with Demosthenes, you may not marvel, Athenians, that Demosthenes and I do differ. For he drinketh water, and I drink wine, and like as we read of an ancient parable of the two gates of sleep. Sunt gemini somni porti, quarum altera furtur cornea, quaveris facilis dacer exitus umbris. Altera candenti perfecta nitens elephanto. Sed falsa ad coelum mittunt insomnia manes. So if we put on sobriety and attention, we shall find it a sure maxim in knowledge, that the more pleasant liquor of wine is the more vaporous, and the braver gate of ivory sendeth forth the falser dreams. 17. But we have now concluded that general part of human philosophy, which contemplateth man segregate, and as he consisteth of body and spirit, wherein we may further note that there seemeth to be a relation or conformity between the good of the mind and the good of the body. For as we divided the good of the body into health, beauty, strength, and pleasure, so the good of the mind, inquired in rational and moral knowledges, tendeth to this, to make the mind sound, and without perturbation, beautiful and graced with decency, and strong and agile for all duties of life. These three, as in the body, so in the mind, seldom meet, and commonly sever. For it is easy to observe that many have strength of wit and courage, but have neither health from perturbations, nor any beauty or decency in their doings. Some again have an elegancy and fineness of carriage, which have neither soundness of honesty nor substance of sufficiency. And some again have honest and reformed minds, that can neither become themselves nor manage business. And sometimes two of them meet, and rarely all three. As for pleasure, we have likewise determined that the mind ought not to be reduced to stupid, but to retain pleasure, confined rather in the subject of it, than in the strength and vigor of it. Roman 23. One civil knowledge is conversant about a subject which of all others is most immersed in matter, and hardliest reduced to axiom. Nevertheless, as Cato the censor said, that the Romans were like sheep, for that a man were better drive a flock of them than one of them, for in a flock, if you could get but some few go right, the rest would follow. So in that respect moral philosophy is more difficile than policy. Again, moral philosophy propoundeth to itself the framing of internal goodness, but civil knowledge requireth only an external goodness. For that as to society sufficeth, and therefore it cometh oft to pass that there be evil times in good governments, for so we find in the holy story. When the kings were good, yet it is added, sed ad hoc pulis non direxerat cor suum ad dominum diem patrum suorum. Again, states as great engines move slowly, and are not so soon put out of frame, for as in Egypt the 7 good years sustained the 7 bad, so governments for a time well grounded do bear out errors following, but the resolution of particular persons is more suddenly subverted. These respects do somewhat qualify the extreme difficulty of civil knowledge. 2. This knowledge hath 3 parts, according to the 3 summary actions of society, which are conversation, negotiation, and government. For man seeketh in society comfort, use, and protection, and they be 3 wisdoms of divers natures, which do often sever wisdom of the behavior, wisdom of business, and wisdom of state. But much less despised, for it hath not only an honor in itself, but an influence also into business and government. The poet saith, nec vultu destru verba tuo, a man may destroy the force of his words with his countenance. So may he of his deeds, saith Cicero, recommending to his brother affability and easy access. Nil interest haber ostium apitum, vultum clausum. It is nothing one to admit men with an open door, and to receive them with a shut and reserved countenance. So we see Atticus, before the first interview between Caesar and Cicero, the war depending, did seriously advise Cicero touching the composing and ordering of his countenance and gesture. And if the government of the countenance be of such effect, much more is that of the speech, and other carriage appertaining to conversation. The true model whereof seemeth to me well expressed by Livy, though not meant for this purpose, ne aut arrogans vidar, aut obnoxious, quorum alterum est alieni libertatis obliti, alterum sui. The sum of behavior is to retain a man's own dignity, without intruding upon the liberty of others. On the other side, if behavior and outward carriage be intended too much, first it may pass into affectation, and then quid deformius quam senam invitam transferra to acta man's life. Yet it consumeth time, and employeth the mind too much. And therefore, as we used to advise young students from company keeping by saying, amici fures temporis, so certainly the intending of the discretion of behavior is a great thief of meditation. Again, such as are accomplished in that form of urbanity please themselves in it, and seldom aspire to higher virtue. Whereas those that have defect in it do seek comeliness by reputation, for where reputation is, almost everything becometh. But where that is not, it must be supplied by puntos and compliments. Again, there is no greater impediment of action than an over-curious observance of decency, and the guide of decency, which is time and season. For as Solomon saith, qui respisit adventos, non seminat, et qui respisit ad nubes, non metet. A man must make his opportunity as oft as find it. To conclude, behavior seemeth to me as a garment of the mind, and to have the conditions of a garment. For it ought to be made in fashion. It ought not to be too curious. It ought to be shaped so as to set forth any good making of the mind and hide any deformity. And above all, it ought not to be too straight or restrained for exercise or motion. But this part of civil knowledge hath been elegantly handled, and therefore I cannot report it for deficient. For the wisdom touching negotiation or business hath not been hitherto collected into writing, to the great derogation of learning and the professors of learning. For from this root springeth chiefly that note or opinion, which by us is expressed in adage to this effect, that there is no great concurrence between learning and wisdom. For of the three wisdoms which we have set down to pertain to civil life, for wisdom of behavior, it is by learned men for the most part despised, as an inferior to virtue, and an enemy to meditation. For wisdom of government, they acquit themselves well when they are called to it. But that happeneth to few, but for the wisdom of business, wherein man's life is most conversant, there be no books of it, except some few scattered advertisements, that have no proportion to the magnitude of this subject. For if books were written of this as the other, I doubt not but learned men with mean experience would far excel men of long experience without learning, and outshoot them in their own bow. 5. Neither needeth it at all to be doubted, that this knowledge should be so variable as it falleth not under precept. For it is much less infinite than science of government, which we see is labored, and in some part reduced. Of this wisdom it seemeth some of the ancient Romans in the saddest and wisest times were professors. For Cicero reporteth, that it was then in use for senators that had name and opinion for general wise men, as Coruncanius, Curius, Laelius, and many others, to walk at certain hours in the place, and to give audience to those that would use their advice, and that the particular citizens would resort unto them, and consult with them of the marriage of a daughter, or of the employing of a son, or of a purchase or bargain, or of an accusation, and every other occasion incident to man's life. So as there is a wisdom of counsel and advice even in private causes, arising out of a universal insight into the affairs of the world, which is used indeed upon particular causes propounded, but is gathered by general observation of causes of like nature. For so we see in the book which Q Cicero writes to his brother, De Petition Consulatis, being the only book of business that I know written by the ancients, although it concerned a particular action then on foot, yet the substance thereof consisteth of many wise and politic axioms, which contain not a temporary, but a perpetual direction in the case of popular elections. But chiefly we may see in those aphorisms which have place amongst divine writings, composed by Solomon the king, of whom the Scriptures testify that his heart was as the sands of the sea, encompassing the world and all worldly matters. We see, I say, not a few profound and excellent cautions, precepts, positions extending to much variety of occasions, whereupon we will stay a while, offering to consideration some number of examples. 6. Sed et cunctis sermonibus qui decuntur nia commodes aurum tuam, ni forte audius servum tuum maledicentem tibi. Here is commended the provident stay of inquiry of that which we would be loth to find, as it was judged great wisdom in Pompeius Magnus, that he burned Sertorius' papers unperused. Ver sapiens, si cum stulto contenderit, sive irascitur, sive ridet, non inveniat requiem. Here is described the great disadvantage which a wise man hath in undertaking a lighter person than himself, which is such an engagement as whether a man turn the matter to jest, or turn it to heat, or howsoever he change copy, he can no ways quit himself well of it. Qui delicit appuritia nutrit servum suum, postea sentiat eam contumesum. Here is signified, that if a man begin too high a pitch in his favours, it doth commonly end in unkindness and unthankfulness. Vidisti verum velosum in oper suo corem rigibus stabit, nec erit inter ignobiles. Here is observed, that of all virtues for rising to honour quickness of dispatch is the best. For superiors many times love not to have those they employ too deep or too sufficient, but ready and diligent. Vidi cunctos vivens qui ambulant sub sol, cum adolescent secundo qui consurgit pro eo. Here is expressed that which was noted by Sylla first, and after him by Tiberius. Plures adorant solum orientem quam occidentem vel meridianum. Si spiritus potestatem, habentis ascenderit super te, locum tuum ni demiseris, quia curatio faciat cesser peccata maxima. Here caution is given, that upon displeasure, retiring is of all courses the unfittest. For a man leaveth things at worst, and depriveth himself of means to make them better. Erat civitas parva, et pauci in e viri, venit contra eam rex magnus, et valavit eam, instruxit communitones per gyrum. Et perfecta est obsidio, inventusc est in e ver pauper et sapiens et liberavit eam per sapientium suam. Et nullus deinceps recordatus est huminis ilius pauperis. Here the corruption of states is set forth, that esteem not virtue or merit longer than they have use of it. Illis responsio frangit iram. Here is noted that silence or rough answer exasperateth, but an answer present and temperate pacifieth. Iter pigrorum quasi seeps spinarum. Here is lively represented how laborious sloth proveth in the end, for when things are deferred till the last instant, and nothing prepared beforehand, every step findeth a briar or impediment, which catcheth or stoppeth. Melior est finis orationis quam principium. Here is taxed the vanity of formal speakers that study more about prefaces and inducements than upon the conclusions and issues of speech, qui cognoscit in judicio facem, non bene facit. Istet pro buxello panis desurit veritatem. Here is noted that a judge were better be a briber than a respecter of persons. For a corrupt judge offendeth not so lightly as a facile. Ver pauper calumnians paupers similes est imbreviamenti in quo parature fames. Here is expressed the extremity of necessitous extortions, figured in the ancient fable of the full and the hungry horseleech. Fons turbatus pede, et vena corrupta, est justus cadens coram impio. Here is noted that one judicial and exemplar iniquity in the face of the world doth trouble the fountains of justice more than many particular injuries passed over by connivance. Qui subtrahit aliquid a pater et a mater, et dicit hoc non est peccatum, particips est homicidii. Here is noted that, whereas men in wronging their best friends used to extenuate their fault, as if they might presume or be bold upon them, it doth contrariwise indeed aggravate their fault, and turneth it from injury to impiety. Noli est amicus hemini iracundo, nec ambulato cum homine furioso. Here caution is given, that in the election of our friends we do principally avoid those which are impatient, as those that will espouse us to many factions and quarrels. Qui conturbat domum suam, possidebit ventum. Here is noted that in domestical separations and breaches men do promise to themselves quieting of their mind and contentment, but still they are deceived of their expectation, and it turneth to wind. Filius sapiens litificat patrum, filius viro stultus maestitia est matri sui. Here is distinguished that fathers have most comfort of the good proof of their sons, but mothers have most discomfort of their ill proof, because women have little discerning of virtue, but of fortune. Qui celat delictum, querit amicitium, sed qui altero sermon repetit, separat fideratos. Here caution is given that reconcilement is better managed by an amnesty, and passing over that which is past, than by apologies and excuses. In omni oper bono erit abundantia. Ubi autem verba sunt plurima, ibi frequenter egestes. Here is noted that words and discourse aboundeth most where there is idleness and want. Primus in sua causa justus, sed venit altera pars, et inquiret in eum. Here is observed that in all causes the first tale possesseth much in sort, that the prejudice thereby wrought will be hardly removed, except some abuse or falsity in the information be detected. Verba bilinguis quasi simplicia, et ipsa perveniunt ad interiora ventris. Here is distinguished that flattery and insinuation, which seemeth set and artificial, sinketh not far, but that entereth deep, which hath show of nature, liberty, and simplicity. Qui erudit dirasarum, Ips sibi injuriam facit, et qui arguit impium, sibi maculam generat. Here caution is given how we tender reprehension to arrogant and scornful natures, whose manner is to esteem it for contumely, and accordingly to return it. Da sapienti occasionum, et adecere I sapientia. Here is distinguished the wisdom brought into habit, and that which is but verbal and swimming only in conceit. For the one upon the occasion presented is quickened and redoubled, the other is amazed and confused. Quamodo in aquis resplendent vultus prospicientium, sic corda hominum manifesta sunt prudentibus. Here the mind of a wise man is compared to a glass, wherein the images of all diversity of natures and customs are represented. From which representation proceedeth that application. Qui sapit, innumerus maribus aptis erit. 7. Thus have I stayed somewhat longer upon these sentences politic of Solomon than is agreeable to the proportion of an example. Led with a desire to give authority to this part of knowledge, which I noted as deficient, and have also attended them with brief observations, such as to my understanding offer no violence to the sense, though I know they may be applied to a more divine use, but it is allowed, even in divinity, that some interpretations, yea, and some writings, have more of the eagle than others, but taking them as instructions for life, they might have received large discourse. If I would have broken them and illustrated them by deducements and examples. 8. Neither was this in use only with the Hebrews, but it is generally to be found in the wisdom of the more ancient times, that as men found out any observation that they thought was good for life, they would gather it and express it in parable or aphorism or fable. But for fables, they were vicegerents and supplies where examples failed, now that the times abound with history. The aim is better when the mark is alive, and therefore the form of writing which of all others is fittest for this variable argument of negotiation and occasions, is that which Machiavel chose wisely and aptly for government, namely, discourse upon histories or examples, for knowledge drawn freshly, and in our view out of particulars, knoweth the way best to particulars again, and it hath much greater life for practice when the discourse attendeth upon the example, than when the example attendeth upon the discourse. For this is no point of order, as it seemeth at first, but of substance. For when the example is the ground, being set down in a history at large, it is set down with all circumstances, which may sometimes control the discourse thereupon made, and sometimes supply it, as a very pattern for action. Whereas the examples alleged for the discourse's sake are cited succinctly, and without particularity, and carry a servile aspect towards the discourse which they are brought in to make good. 9. But this difference is not amiss to be remembered, that as history of times is the best ground for discourse of government, such as Machiavel handleth, so histories of lives is the most popular for discourse of business, because it is more conversant in private actions. Nay, there is a ground of discourse for this purpose fitter than them both, which is discourse upon letters, such as are wise and weighty, as many are of Cicero et Atticum, and others. For letters have a great and more particular representation of business than either chronicles or lives. Thus have we spoken both of the matter and form of this part of civil knowledge, touching negotiation, which we note to be deficient. 10. But yet there is another part of this part, which differeth as much from that whereof we have spoken as sapper in sibi sapper, the one moving as it were to the circumference, the other to the center. For there is a wisdom of counsel, and again there is a wisdom of pressing a man's own fortune. And they do sometimes meet, and often sever, for many are wise in their own ways, that are weak for government or counsel. Like ants, which is a wise creature for itself, but very hurtful for the garden. This wisdom the Romans did take much knowledge of, nam Paul sapiens, saith the comical poet, fingit fortunam sibi. And it grew to an adage, faber quisque fortuni proprii, and Livy attributed it to Cato I, in hoc viro tantavis animi et ingenii inirat, at quacunc loco natus esset sibi ipse fortunam facturis vidretur. 11. This conceit or position, if it be too much declared and professed, hath been thought a thing impolitic and unlucky, as was observed in Timotheus the Athenian, who, having done many great services to the state in his government, and giving an account thereof to the people as the matter was, did conclude every particular with this clause, and in this fortune had no part, and it came so to pass, that he never prospered in anything he took in hand afterwards. For this is too high and too arrogant, savouring of that which Ezekiel saith of Pharaoh Dissus, Fluvius est neus et ego feci memit ipsum, or of that which another prophet speaketh, that men offer sacrifices to their nets and snares, and that which the poet expresseth, dextra mehi Deus, et tellum quod missile libro, nuncid sint. For these confidences were ever unhallowed and unblessed, and therefore those that were great politiques indeed ever ascribed their successes to their felicity and not to their skill or virtue. For so Sylla surnamed himself Felix, not Magnus. So Caesar said to the master of the ship, Caesarem portis et fortunam ejus. 12. But yet, nevertheless, these positions, faber quisque fortuni sui, and the like, being taken and used as spurs to industry, and not as stirrups to insolency, rather for resolution, than for the presumption or outward declaration, have been ever thought sound and good, and are no question imprinted in the greatest minds, who are so sensible of this opinion as they can scarce contain it within. As we see in Augustus Caesar, who was rather diverse from his uncle than inferior in virtue, how when he died, he desired his friends about him to give him a plaudite, as if he were conscious to himself that he had played his part well upon the stage. This part of knowledge we do report also as deficient, not but that it is practised too much, but it hath not been reduced to writing. And, therefore, lest it should seem to any that it is not comprehensible by axiom, it is requisite, as we did in the former, that we set down some heads or passages of it. 13. Wherein it may appear at the first a new and unwonted argument to teach men how to raise and make their fortune. A doctrine wherein every man perchance will be ready to yield himself a disciple, till he see the difficulty, for fortune layeth as heavy impositions as virtue. And it is as hard and severe a thing to be a true politique, as to be truly moral. But the handling hereof concerneth learning greatly, both in honor and in substance. In honor, because pragmatical men may not go away with an opinion that learning is like a lark, that can mount and sing, and please herself, and nothing else, but may know that she holdeth as well of the hawk, that can soar aloft, and can also descend and strike upon the prey in substance, because it is the perfect law of inquiry of truth, that nothing be in the globe of matter, which should not be likewise in the globe of crystal or form. That is, that there be not anything in being and action which should not be drawn and collected into contemplation and doctrine. Neither doth learning admire or esteem of this architecture of fortune otherwise than as of an inferior work. For no man's fortune can be an end worthy of his being, and many times the worthiest men do abandon their fortune willingly for better respects, but nevertheless fortune as an organ of virtue and merit deserveth the consideration. 14. First, therefore, the precept which I conceive to be most summary towards the prevailing in fortune is to obtain that window which Momus did require, who seeing in the frame of man's heart such angles and recesses, found fault there was not a window to look into them, that is, to procure good informations of particulars touching persons, their natures, their desires and ends, their customs and fashions, their helps and advantages, and whereby they chiefly stand, so again their weaknesses and disadvantages, and where they lie most open and obnoxious their friends, factions, dependencies, and again their opposites, enviers, competitors, their moods and times, sola viri mals additis et tempora noris, their principles, rules, and observations, and the like, and this not only of persons but of actions, what are on foot from time to time, and how they are conducted, favored, opposed, and how they import, and the like. For the knowledge of present actions is not only material in itself, but without it also the knowledge of persons is very erroneous, for men change with the actions, and whilst they are in pursuit they are one, and when they return to their nature they are another. These informations of particulars, touching persons and actions, are as the minor propositions in every active syllogism. For no excellency of observations which are as the major propositions can suffice to ground a conclusion. If there be error and mistaking in the minors. 15. That this knowledge is possible, Solomon is our surety, who saith, concilium in cord viri tanquam aqua profunda, sed ver prudens exoriat alud. And although the knowledge itself falleth not under precept because it is of individuals, yet the instructions for the obtaining of it may. 16. We will begin, therefore, with this precept, according to the ancient opinion, that the sinews of wisdom are slowness of belief and distrust, that more trust be given to countenances and deeds than to words, and in words rather to sudden passages and surprised words than to set and purposed words. Neither let that be feared which is said, fronting nullifies, which is meant of a general outward behavior, and not of the private and subtle motions and labors of the countenance and gesture, which, as Q. Cicero elegantly saith, is animi janua, the gate of the mind. None more close than Tiberius, and yet Tacitus saith of Gallus, etnam vultu offensionum conjectaverat. So again, noting the differing character and manner of his commending Germanicus and Drusus in the Senate, he saith, touching his fashion wherein he carried his speech of Germanicus, thus magis in specim adornatis verbis. Quam penitus sentire crederetur, but of Drusus thus, pauciribus sed intentir, et fide oration. And in another place, speaking of his character of speech when he did anything that was gracious and popular, he saith, that in other things he was velut illectantium verborum, but then again, salutius loquibatur quando subvenirt. So that there is no such artificer of dissimulation, nor no such commanded countenance vultus jussus, that can sever from a feigned tale some of these fashions, either a more slight and careless fashion, or more set and formal, or more tedious and wandering, or coming from a man more dryly and hardly. 17. Neither are deeds such assured pledges, as that they may be trusted without a judicious consideration of their magnitude and nature. Fraust sibi in parvis fidem pristrut ut major emolumento fallat. And the Italian thinketh himself upon the point to be bought and sold, when he is better used than he was wont to be without manifest cause. For small favors, they do but lull men to sleep, both as to caution and as to industry, and are, as Demosthenes calleth them, alimentus secordiae. So again we see how false the nature of some deeds are in that particular which Mucianus practised upon Antonius Primus, upon that hollow and unfaithful reconcilement which was made between them, whereupon Mucianus advanced many of the friends of Antonius. Simul amicis ejus praefecturas et tribunatus largitur, wherein, under pretence to strengthen him, he did desolate him, and won from him his dependence. 18. As for words, though they be like waters to physicians, full of flattery and uncertainty, yet they are not to be despised, specially with the advantage of passion and affection. For so we see Tiberius, upon a stinging and incensing speech of Agrippina, came a step forth of his dissimulation when he said, "You are hurt because you do not reign, of which Tacitus saith, audita hic reram occulti pectoris vocem illicura correctamque Greco versu admanuit. Ideo liti quia non rignarit," and therefore the poet doth elegantly call passions tortures that urge men to confess their secrets. Vino torris et ira. And experience showeth there are few men so true to themselves and so settled but that, sometimes upon heat, sometimes upon bravery, sometimes upon kindness, sometimes upon trouble of mind and weakness, they open themselves, specially if they be put to it with a counter dissimulation, according to the proverb of Spain, "Die mentira y sacar as verdad," tell a lie and find a truth. 19. As for the knowing of men which is at second hand from reports, men's weaknesses and faults are best known from their enemies, their virtues and abilities from their friends, their customs and times from their servants, their conceits and opinions from their familiar friends, with whom they discourse most. General fame is light, and the opinions conceived by superiors or equals are deceitful. For to such men are more masked virior fama e domesticis emanat. 20. But the soundest disclosing and expounding of men is by their natures and ends, wherein the weakest sort of men are best interpreted by their natures, and the wisest by their ends. For it was both pleasantly and wisely said, though I think very untruly, by a nuncio of the Pope, returning from a certain nation where he served as liger, whose opinion being asked touching the appointment of one to go in his place, he wished that in any case they did not send one that was too wise, because no very wise man would ever imagine what they in that country were like to do. And certainly it is an error frequent for men to shoot over, and to suppose deeper ends and more compass reaches than are, the Italian proverb being elegant, and for the most part true, di danari di seno e di fede, si ne manco ci non credi. There is commonly less money, less wisdom, and less good faith than men do account upon. 21. But princes, upon a far other reason, are best interpreted by their natures, and private persons by their ends. For princes being at the top of human desires, they have for the most part no particular ends whereto they aspire, by distance from which a man might take measure and scale of the rest of their actions and desires, which is one of the causes that maketh their hearts more inscrutable. Neither is it sufficient to inform ourselves in men's ends and natures of the variety of them only, but also of the predominancy. What humor reigneth most, and what end is principally sought. For so we see, when Tigellinus saw himself outstripped by Petronius Turpilianus in Nero's humors of pleasures, Metasidius Rimature, he wrought upon Nero's fears, whereby he broke the other's neck. 22. But to all this part of inquiry, the most compendious way resteth in three things. The first, to have general acquaintance and inwardness with those which have general acquaintance and look most into the world, and specially according to the diversity of business, and the diversity of persons, to have privacy and conversation with some one friend at least which is perfect and well intelligenced in every several kind. The second is to keep a good mediocrity in liberty of speech and secrecy, in most things liberty, secrecy where it importeth, for liberty of speech inviteth and provoketh liberty to be used again, and so bringeth much to a man's knowledge. And secrecy on the other side induceth trust and inwardness. The last is the reducing of a man's self to this watchful and serene habit, as to make account and purpose in every conference and action, as well to observe as to act. For as Epictetus would have a philosopher in every particular action to say to himself, et hoc volo, et etiam institutum servere, so a politic man in everything should say to himself, et hoc volo, esse etiam aliquid adicere. I have stayed the longer upon this precept of obtaining good information because it is a main part by itself, which answereth to all the rest. But, above all things, caution must be taken that men have a good stay and hold of themselves, and that this much knowing do not draw on much meddling, for nothing is more unfortunate than light and rash intermeddling in many matters. So that this variety of knowledge tendeth, in conclusion, but only to this, to make a better and freer choice of those actions which may concern us, and to conduct them with the less error and the more dexterity. 23. The second precept concerning this knowledge is, for men to take good information touching their own person, and well to understand themselves, knowing that, as St. James saith, though men look oft in a glass, yet they do suddenly forget themselves, wherein as the divine glass is the word of God, so the politic glass is the state of the world, or times wherein we live, in the which we are to behold ourselves. 24. For men ought to take an impartial view of their own abilities and virtues, and again of their wants and impediments, accounting these with the most, and those other with the least, and from this view and examination to frame the considerations following. 25. First, to consider how the constitution of their nature sorteth with the general state of the times, which if they find agreeable and fit, then in all things to give themselves more scope and liberty. But if differing and dissonant, then in the whole course of their life to be more close retired and reserved, as we see in Tiberius, who was never seen at a play, and came not into the Senate in 12 of his last years, whereas Augustus Caesar lived ever in men's eyes, which Tacitus observeth, alia Tiberio morum via. 26. Secondly, to consider how their nature sorteth with professions and courses of life, and accordingly to make election, if they be free, and, if engaged, to make the departure at the first opportunity, as we see was done by Duke Valentine, was designed by his father to a sacerdotal profession, but quitted it soon after in regard of his parts and inclination, being such nevertheless, as a man cannot tell well whether they were worse for a prince or for a priest. 27. Thirdly, to consider how they sort with those whom they are like to have competitors and concurrents, and to take that course wherein there is most solitude, and themselves like to be most eminent, as Caesar Julius did, who at first was an orator or pleader, but when he saw the excellency of Cicero, Hortensius, Catullus, and others for eloquence, and saw there was no man of reputation for the wars but Pompeius, upon whom the state was forced to rely, he forsook his course begun towards a civil and popular greatness, and transferred his designs to a martial greatness. 28. Fourthly, in the choice of their friends and dependents, to proceed according to the composition of their own nature, as we may see in Caesar, all whose friends and followers were men active and effectual, but not solemn, or of reputation. 29. Fifthly, to take special heed how they guide themselves by examples, in thinking they can do as they see others do, whereas perhaps their natures and carriages are far differing. In which error it seemeth Pompey was, of whom Cicero saith that he was wont often to say, ego non patero, wherein he was much abused, the natures and proceedings of himself and his example being the unlikest in the world, the one being fierce, violent, and pressing the fact, the other solemn, and full of majesty and circumstance, and therefore the less effectual, But this precept touching the politic knowledge of ourselves hath many other branches, whereupon we cannot insist. 30. Next to the well understanding and discerning of a man's self, there followeth the well opening and revealing a man's self, wherein we see nothing more usual than for the more able man to make the less show. For there is a great advantage in the well setting forth of a man's virtues, fortunes, merits, and again, in the artificial covering of a man's weaknesses, defects, disgraces, staying upon the one, sliding from the other, cherishing the one by circumstances, gracing the other by exposition, and the like, wherein we see what Tacitus saith of Mucianus, who was the greatest politic of his time: omnium qui dixerat fecerat art quadam ostentator, which requireth indeed some art, lest it turn tedious and arrogant, but yet so, as ostentation though it be to the first degree of vanity seemeth, to me rather a vice in manners than in policy. For as it is said, aut actor calumniar, semper aliquid haeret, so, except it be in a ridiculous degree of deformity, aut actor te vendita, semper aliquid haeret, for it will stick with the more ignorant and inferior sort of men, though men of wisdom and rank do smile at it and despise it, and yet the authority won with many doth countervail the disdain of a few. But if it be carried with decency and government, as with a natural, pleasant, and ingenious fashion, or at times when it is mixed with some peril and unsafety, as in military persons, or at times when others are most envied, or with easy and careless passage to it and from it, without dwelling too long, or being too serious, or with an equal freedom of taxing a man's self, as well as gracing himself, or by occasion of repelling or putting down others' injury or insolency, it doth greatly add to reputation, and surely not a few solid natures, that want this ventosity and cannot sail in the height of the winds, are not without some prejudice and disadvantage by their moderation. 31. But for these flourishes and enhancements of virtue, as they are not perchance unnecessary, so it is at least necessary that virtue be not disvalued and embissed under the just price, which is done in 3 manners: by offering and obtruding a man's self, wherein men think he is rewarded when he is accepted; by doing too much, which will not give that which is well done leave to settle, and in the end induceth satiety; and by finding too soon the fruit of a man's virtue, in commendation, applause, honor, favor, wherein if a man be pleased with a little, let him hear what is truly said, cave ni insutis rebus majoribus vidaris. Si hic te res parva secuti magna delectat. 32. But the covering of defects is of no less importance than the valuing of good parts, which may be done likewise in 3 manners: by caution, by color, and by confidence. Caution is when men do ingeniously and discreetly avoid to be put into those things for which they are not proper, whereas contrariwise bold and unquiet spirits will thrust themselves into matters without difference, and so publish and proclaim all their wants. Color is when men make a way for themselves to have a construction made of their faults or wants, as proceeding from a better cause, or intended for some other purpose. For of the one it is well said, si platet vitium proximitate boni, And therefore whatsoever want a man hath, he must see that he pretend the virtue that shadoweth it. As if he be dull, he must affect gravity; if a coward, mildness, and so the rest. For the second, a man must frame some probable cause why he should not do his best, and why he should dissemble his abilities, and for that purpose must use to dissemble those abilities which are notorious in him, to give color that his true wants are but industries and dissimulations. For confidence, it is the last but the surest remedy, namely, to depress and seem to despise whatsoever a man cannot attain. Observing the good principle of the merchants, who endeavor to raise the price of their own commodities, and to beat down the price of others. But there is a confidence that passeth this other, which is to face out a man's own defects, in seeming to conceive that he is best in those things wherein he is failing, and to help that again, to seem on the other side that he hath least opinion of himself in those things wherein he is best, like as we shall see it commonly in poets, that if they show their verses, and you accept to any, they will say that that line cost them more labor than any of the rest, and presently will seem to disable and suspect rather some other line, which they know well enough to be the best in the number. But above all, in this writing and helping of a man's self in his own carriage, he must take heed he show not himself dismantled, and exposed to scorn and injury, by too much dulceness, goodness, and facility of nature, but show some sparkles of liberty, spirit, and edge. Which kind of fortified carriage, with a ready rescussing of a man's self from scorns, is sometimes of necessity imposed upon men by somewhat in their person or fortune. But it ever succeedeth with good felicity. 33. Another precept of this knowledge is by all possible endeavor to frame the mind to be pliant and obedient to occasion. For nothing hindereth men's fortunes so much as this. Idem manebat, nec idem decebat. Men are where they were when occasions turn, and therefore to Cato, whom Livy maketh such an architect of fortune, he addeth that he had versatile ingenium, and thereof it cometh that these grave solemn wits, which must be like themselves and cannot make departures, have more dignity than felicity. But in some it is nature to be somewhat vicious and enwrapped, and not easy to turn. In some it is a conceit that is almost a nature, which is, that men can hardly make themselves believe that they ought to change their course, when they have found good by it in former experience. For Machiavel noted wisely how Fabius Maximus would have been temporizing still, according to his old bias, when the nature of the war was altered and required hot pursuit. In some other it is want of point and penetration in their judgment, that they do not discern when things have a period, but come in too late after the occasion, as Demosthenes compareth the people of Athens to country fellows, when they play in a fence school, that if they have a blow, then they remove their weapon to that ward, and not before. In some other it is a lothness to lose labors past, and a conceit that they can bring about occasions to their ply, and yet in the end, when they see no other remedy, then they come to it with disadvantage. As Tarquinius, that gave for the third part of Sibylla's books the treble price, when he might at first have had all three for the simple. But from whatsoever root or cause this restiveness of mind proceedeth, it is a thing most prejudicial, and nothing is more politic than to make the wheels of our mind concentric and voluble with the wheels of fortune. 34. Another precept of this knowledge, which hath some affinity with that we last spoke of, but with difference, is that which is well expressed, fates exceed dasque, that men do not only turn with the occasions, but also run with the occasions, and not strain their credit or strength to over hard or extreme points, but choose in their actions that which is most passable, not occupy them too much about one matter, win opinion of moderation, please the most, and make a show of a perpetual felicity in all they undertake, which cannot but mightily increase reputation. 35. Another part of this knowledge seemeth to have some repugnancy with the former two, but not as I understand it. And it is that which Demosthenes uttereth in high terms, et quemid modum receptum est, at exercitum jucet imperator. Sic et accordates viris res ipsi ducendi, at qui ipsis videntur, e gerantur, et non ipsi eventus persequi cagantur. For, if we observe, we shall find two differing kinds of sufficiency in managing of business. Some can make use of occasions aptly and dexterously, but plot little. Some can urge and pursue their own plots well, but cannot accommodate nor take in, either of which is very imperfect without the other. 36. Another part of this knowledge is the observing a good mediocrity in the declaring or not declaring a man's self, for although depth of secrecy, and making way qualis est via navis in mare, which the French calleth sowards menes, when men set things in work without opening themselves at all, be sometimes both prosperous and admirable, yet many times dissimulatio errors paret, qui dissimulatorum ipsum elaquint. And therefore we see the greatest politiques have in a natural and free manner professed their desires, rather than been reserved and disguised in them. For so we see that Lucius Sylla made a kind of profession, that he wished all men happy or unhappy, as they stood his friends or enemies. So Caesar, when he went first into Gaul, made no scruple to profess that he had rather be first in a village than second at Rome. So again, as soon as he had begun the war, we see what Cicero saith of him, alter meaning of Caesar non recusat, sed quadmodo postulat, ut est sic appellatur tyrannus. So we may see in a letter of Cicero to Atticus, that Augustus Caesar, in his very entrance into affairs, when he was a darling of the Senate, yet in his harangues to the people would swear ita parentes honores consequi licet, which was no less than the tyranny, save that, to help it, he would stretch forth his hand towards a statue of Caesar's that was erected in the place, and men laughed and wondered, and said, "Is it possible?" or "Did you ever hear the like?" and yet thought he meant no hurt. He did it so handsomely and ingenuously, and all these were prosperous, whereas Pompey, who tended to the same ends, but in a more dark and dissembling manner, as Tacitus saith of him, occultur non melior, wherein Sallust concurreth, or probo animo in vericundo, made it his design, by infinite secret engines, to cast the state into an absolute anarchy and confusion, that the state might cast itself into his arms for necessity and protection, and so the sovereign power be put upon him. And he never seen in it, and when he had brought it, as he thought, to that point when he was chosen consul alone, as never any was, yet he could make no great matter of it, because men understood him not, but was fain in the end to go the beaten track of getting arms into his hands, by colour of the doubt of Caesar's designs so tedious. Casual and unfortunate are these deep dissimulations, whereof it seemeth Tacitus made this judgment, that they were a cunning of an inferior form in regard of true policy, attributing the one to Augustus, the other to Tiberius, where, speaking of Livia, he saith, et cum artibus mariti simulation filii bene compostia, for surely the continual habit of dissimulation is but a weak and sluggish cunning, and not greatly politic. 37. Another precept of this architecture of fortune is to accustom our minds to judge of the proportion or value of things, as they conduce and are material to our particular ends, and that to do substantially and not superficially. For we shall find the logical part, as I may term it, of some men's minds good, but the mathematical part erroneous. That is, they can well judge of consequences, but not of proportions and comparison, preferring things of show and sense before things of substance and effect. So some fall in love with access to princes, others with popular fame and applause, supposing they are things of great purchase, when in many cases they are but matters of envy, peril, and impediment. So some measure things according to the labor and difficulty or assiduity which are spent about them, and think, if they be ever moving, that they must needs advance and proceed, as Caesar saith in a despising manner of Cato II, when he describeth how laborious and indefatigable he was to no great purpose, hic omnium magno studio agebat. So in most things men are ready to abuse themselves in thinking the greatest means to be best, when it should be the fittest. 38. As for the true marshalling of men's pursuits towards their fortune, as they are more or less material, I hold them to stand thus. First, the amendment of their own minds. For the removal of the impediments of the mind will sooner clear the passages of fortune than the obtaining fortune will remove the impediments of the mind. In the second place, I set down wealth and means, which I know most men would have placed first, because of the general use which it beareth towards all variety of occasions. But that opinion I may condemn with like reason as Machiavel doth that other, that monies were the sinews of the wars. Whereas saith he, the true sinews of the wars are the sinews of men's arms, that is, a valiant, populous, and military nation. And he voucheth aptly the authority of Solon, who, when Croesus showed him his treasury of gold, said to him, that if another came that had better iron, he would be master of his gold. In like manner it may be truly affirmed that it is not monies that are the sinews of fortune, but it is the sinews and steel of men's minds, wit, courage, audacity, resolution, temper, industry, and the like. In the third place I set down reputation, because of the peremptory tides and currents it hath, which, if they be not taken in their due time, are seldom recovered, it being extreme hard to play an after game of reputation. And lastly, I place honor, which is more easily won by any of the other three, much more by all, and any of them can be purchased by honor. To conclude this precept, as there is order and priority in matter, so is there in time, the preposterous placing whereof is one of the commonest errors, while men fly to their ends when they should intend their beginnings, and do not take things in order of time as they come on, but marshal them according to greatness and not according to instance, not observing the good precept quod nunc instat agamus. 39. Another precept of this knowledge is not to embrace any matters which do occupy too great a quantity of time, but to have that sounding in a man's ears, sed fugit interi fugit irreparabile tempus, and that is the cause why those which take their course of rising by professions of burden, as lawyers, orators, painful divines, and the like, are not commonly so politic for their own fortune, otherwise than in their ordinary way, because they want time to learn particulars, to wait occasions, and to devise plots. 40. Another precept of this knowledge is to imitate nature, which doth nothing in vain, which surely a man may do, if he do well interlace his business, and bend not his mind too much upon that which he principally intendeth. For a man ought in every particular action so to carry the motions of his mind, and so to have one thing under another, as if he cannot have that he seeketh in the best degree, yet to have it in a second, or so in a third. And if he can have no part of that which he purposed, yet to turn the use of it to somewhat else. And if he cannot make anything of it for the present, yet to make it as a seed of somewhat in time to come. And if he can contrive no effect or substance from it, yet to win some good opinion by it, or the like, so that he should exact an account of himself of every action, to reap somewhat, and not to stand amazed and confused if he fail of that he chiefly meant, for nothing is more impolitic than to mind actions wholly one by one. For he that doth so loseth infinite occasions which intervene, and are many times more proper and propitious, or somewhat that he shall need afterwards, than for that which he urgeth for the present, and therefore men must be perfect in that rule, hic apportet facere, et illa non imiter. 41. Another precept of this knowledge is, not to engage a man's self peremptorily in anything, though it seem not liable to accident, but ever to have a window to fly out at, or a way to retire, following the wisdom in the ancient fable of the two frogs, which consulted when their plash was dry whither they should go, and the one moved to go down into a pit, because it was not likely the water would dry there, but the other answered, True, but if it do, how shall we get out again? 42. Another precept of this knowledge is that ancient precept of bias, construed not to any point of perfidiousness, but to caution and moderation, et ama tanquam inimicis futuris et odi tanquam amateuris. For utterly betrayeth all utility for men to embark themselves too far into unfortunate friendships, troublesome spleens, and childish and humorous envies or emulations. 43. But I continue this beyond the measure of an example, led, because I would not have such knowledges, which I note as deficient, to be thought things imaginative or in the air, or an observation or too much made of, But things of bulk and mass, whereof an end is more hardly made than a beginning, it must be likewise conceived that in these points which I mention and set down, they are far from complete tractates of them, but only as small pieces for patterns. And lastly, no man, I suppose, will think that I mean fortunes are not obtained without all this ado. For I know they come tumbling into some men's laps, and a number obtain good fortunes by diligence in a plain way, little intermeddling, and keeping themselves from gross errors. 44. But as Cicero, when he setteth down an idea of a perfect orator, doth not mean that every pleader should be such. And so likewise, when a prince or a courtier hath been described by such as have handled those subjects, the mold hath used to be made according to the perfection of the art, and not according to common practice, so I understand it, that it ought to be done in the description of a politic man, I mean politic for his own fortune. 45. But it must be remembered all this while, that the precepts which we have set down are of that kind which may be counted and called body arts. As for evil arts, if a man would set down for himself that principle of Machiavel, that a man seek not to attain virtue itself, but the appearance only thereof, because the credit of virtue is a help, but the use of it is cumber, or that other of his principles, that he presuppose that men are not fitly to be wrought otherwise but by fear, and therefore that he seek to have every man obnoxious, low, and in straits, which the Italians call seminar spine, to sow thorns, or that other principle, contained in the verse which Cicero citeth. Cadent amici, de modo inimici intercident, as the triumvirs, which sold every one to other the lives of their friends for the deaths of their enemies, or that other protestation of L. Catalina, to set on fire and trouble states, to the end to fish in drowny waters, and to unwrap their fortunes. Ego si quid infortunis meis excitatum sit incendium, id non aqua sed ruina restinguam, or that other principle of Lysander, that children are to be deceived with comfits, and men with oaths, and the like evil and corrupt positions, whereof as in all things there are more in number than of the good, certainly with these dispensations from the laws of charity and integrity. The pressing of a man's fortune may be more hasty and compendious, but it is in life as it is in ways. The shortest way is commonly the foulest, and surely the fairer way is not much about. 46. But men, if they be in their own power, and do bear and sustain themselves, and be not carried away with a whirlwind or tempest of ambition, ought in the pursuit of their own fortune to set before their eyes not only that general map of the world, that all things are vanity and vexation of spirit, but many other more particular cards and directions, chiefly that being without well-being is a curse, and the greater being the greater curse. Qui vobis, qui digna, viri pro laudibus istis premia passi rear salvi, pulcherum primum dii mors dabunt vestri. And so of the contrary. And secondly, they ought to look up to the eternal providence and divine judgment, which often subverteth the wisdom of evil plots and imaginations, according to that scripture, he hath conceived mischief, and shall bring forth a vain thing. And although men should refrain themselves from injury and evil arts, Yet this incessant and sabbathless pursuit of a man's fortune leaveth not tribute, which we owe to God of our time, who we see demandeth a tenth of our substance, and a seventh, which is more strict, of our time, and it is to small purpose to have an erected face towards heaven, and a perpetual grovelling spirit upon earth, eating dust as doth the serpent, at a fidget, homo divini particulam ori. And if any man flatter himself that he will employ his fortune well, though he should obtain it ill, as was said concerning Augustus Caesar, and after of Septimius Severus, that either they should never have been born, or else they should never have died, they did so much mischief in the pursuit and ascent of their greatness, and so much good when they were established. Yet these compensations and satisfactions are good to be used, but never good to be purposed. And lastly, it is not amiss for men, in their race towards their fortune, to cool themselves a little with that conceit which is elegantly expressed by the Emperor Charles V. in his instructions to the king his son, that fortune hath somewhat of the nature of a woman, that if she he too much wooed, she is the farther off. This last is but a remedy for those whose tastes are corrupted. Let men rather build upon that foundation which is as a cornerstone of divinity and philosophy, wherein they join close, namely, that same primum quaerite. For divinity saith, primum quaerite regnum Dei, et ista omnia agituntur vobis, and philosophy saith, primum quaerite bona animi, caetera aut adurunt, aut non obrunt. And although the human foundation hath somewhat of the sands, as we see in M. Brutus, when he broke forth into that speech, T collui virtus ut rem, asked tu nomen inaneis. Yet the divine foundation is upon the rock. But this may serve for a taste of that knowledge which I noted as deficient. 47. Concerning government. It is a part of knowledge secret and retired in both these respects in which things are deemed secret. For some things are secret because they are hard to know, and some because they are not fit to utter. We see all governments are obscure and invisible. Totem confusa per artis mens agitat molem, et magno si corpor misset. Such is the description of governments. We see the government of God over the world is hidden, insomuch as it seemeth to participate of much irregularity and confusion. The government of the soul in moving the body is inward and profound, and the passages thereof hardly to be reduced to demonstration. Again, the wisdom of antiquity, the shadows whereof are in the poets in the description of torments and pains. Next unto the crime of rebellion, which was the giant's offence, doth detest the offence of futility, as in Sisyphus and Tantalus. But this was meant of particulars, nevertheless even unto the general rules and discourses of policy and government, there is due a reverent and reserved handling. 48. But contrariwise in the governors towards the governed, all things ought, as far as the frailty of man permitteth, to be manifest and revealed. For so it is expressed in the Scriptures touching the government of God, that this globe, which seemeth to us a dark and shady body, is in the view of God as crystal, et in conspectu sedis tanquam, mer vitrium simile cristallo. So unto princes and states, and specially towards wise senates and councils, the natures and dispositions of the people, their conditions and necessities, their factions and combinations, their animosities and discontents ought to be. In regard of the variety of their intelligences, the wisdom of their observations, and the height of their station where they keep sentinel, in great part clear and transparent. Wherefore, considering that I write to a king that is a master of this science, and is so well assisted, I think it decent to pass over this part in silence, as willing to obtain the certificate which one of the ancient philosophers aspired unto, who being silent, when others contended to make demonstration of their abilities by speech, desired it might be certified for his part, that there was one that knew how to hold his peace. 49. Notwithstanding, for the more public part of government, which is laws, I think good to note only one deficiency, which is, that all those which have written of laws have written either as philosophers or as lawyers, and none as statesmen. As for the philosophers, they make imaginary laws for imaginary commonwealths, and their discourses are as the stars, which give little light because they are so high. For the lawyers, they write according to the states where they live what is received law, and not what ought to be law, for the wisdom of a lawmaker is one, and of a lawyer is another. For there are in nature certain fountains of justice whence all civil laws are derived but as streams. And like as waters do take tinctures and tastes from the soils through which they run, so do civil laws vary according to the regions and governments where they are planted, though they proceed from the same fountains. Again, the wisdom of a lawmaker consisteth not only in a platform of justice, but in the application thereof, taking into consideration by what means laws may be made certain, and what are the causes and remedies of the doubtfulness and uncertainty of law, by what means laws may be made apt and easy to be executed, and what are the impediments and remedies in the execution of laws, what influence laws touching private right of meum and tuum have into the public state, and how they may be made apt and agreeable, how laws are to be penned and delivered, whether in texts or in acts, brief or large, with preambles or without, how they are to be pruned and reformed from time to time, and what is the best means to keep them from being too vast in volume, or too full of multiplicity and crossness, how they are to be expounded, when upon causes emergent and judicially discussed, and when upon responses and conferences touching general points or questions, how they are to be pressed, rigorously or tenderly, how they are to be mitigated by equity and good conscience, and whether discretion and strict law are to be mingled in the same courts, or kept apart in several courts. Again, how the practice, profession, and erudition of law is to be censured and governed, and many other points touching the administration, and, as I may term it, animation of laws, upon which I insist the less, because I purpose, if God give me leave, having begun a work of this nature in aphorisms, to propound it hereafter, noting it in the meantime for deficient. 50. And for your Majesty's laws of England, I could say much of their dignity, and somewhat of their defect, but they cannot but excel the civil laws in fitness for the government, for the civil law was non hos quisitum munus in usus, it was not made for the countries which it governeth. Hereof I cease to speak, because I will not intermingle matter of action with matter of general learning. Roman 24. Thus have I concluded this portion of learning touching civil knowledge, and with civil knowledge have concluded human philosophy. And with human philosophy, philosophy in general, and being now at some pause, looking back into that I have passed through. This writing seemeth to me si nunquam fallit imago, as far as a man can judge of his own work, not much better than that noise or sound which musicians make while they are in tuning their instruments, which is nothing pleasant to hear, but yet is a cause why the music is sweeter afterwards. So have I been content to tune the instruments of the Muses, that they may play that have better hands. And surely, when I set before me the condition of these times, in which learning hath made her third visitation or circuit, in all the qualities thereof, as the excellency and vivacity of the wits of this age, the noble helps and lights which we have by the travails of ancient writers, the art of printing, which communicateth books to men of all fortunes, the openness of the world by navigation, which hath disclosed multitudes of experiments, and a mass of natural history, the leisure wherewith these times abound, not employing men so generally in civil business, as the states of Grecia did, in respect of their popularity, and the state of Rome, in respect of the greatness of their monarchy, the present disposition of these times at this instant to peace, the consumption of all that ever can be said in controversies of religion, which have so much diverted men from other sciences, the perfection of your Majesty's learning, which as a phoenix may call whole volleys of wits to follow you, and the inseparable propriety of time, which is ever more and more to disclose truth. I cannot but be raised to this persuasion, that this third period of time will far surpass that of the Grecian and Roman learning, only if men will know their own strength and their own weakness both, and take one from the other, light of invention, and not fire of contradiction, and esteem of the inquisition of truth as of an enterprise, and not as of a quality or ornament, and employ wit and magnificence to things of worth and excellency, and not to things vulgar and of popular estimation. As for my labors, if any man shall please himself or others in the reprehension of them, they shall make that ancient and patient request. Verbera, said Audi, let men reprehend them, so they observe and weigh them. For the appeal is lawful though it may be, it shall not be needful from the first cogitations of men to their second, and from the nearer times to the times further off. Now let us come to that learning, which both the former times were not so blessed as to know. Sacred and inspired divinity, the Sabbath and port of all men's labors and peregrinations. Roman 25. 1. The prerogative of God extendeth as well to the reason as to the will of man, so that as we are to obey his law, though we find a reluctation in our will, so we are to believe his word, though we find a reluctation in our reason. For, if we believe only that which is agreeable to our sense, we give consent to the matter, and not to the author, which is no more than we would do towards a suspected and discredited witness. But that faith which was accounted to Abraham for righteousness was of such a point as whereat Sarah laughed, who therein was an image of natural reason. 2. Howbeit, if we will truly consider of it more worthy, is to believe than to know as we now know. For in knowledge man's mind suffereth from sense, but in belief it suffereth from spirit, such one as it holdeth for more authorized than itself, and so suffereth from the worthier agent. Otherwise it is of the state of man glorified, for then faith shall cease, and we shall know as we are known. 3. Wherefore we conclude that sacred theology, which in our idiom we call divinity, is grounded only upon the word and oracle of God, and not upon the light of nature, for it is written, Caeli inerrant gloriam Dei, but it is not written, Caeli inerrant voluntatem Dei, but of that it is said, ad legem et testimonium, si non fecirent secundum verbum istud. C. This holdeth not only in those points of faith which concern the great mysteries of the deity, of the creation, of the redemption, but likewise those which concern the law moral. Be like to your heavenly Father, that suffereth his rain to fall upon the just and unjust. To this it ought to be applauded, nec vox hominum sonet. It is a voice beyond the light of nature. So we see the heathen poets, when they fall upon a libertine passion, do still expostulate with laws and moralities, as if they were opposite and malignant to nature, et quod natura remittit, invita jura negant. So said Dendames the Indian unto Alexander's messengers, that he had heard somewhat of Pythagoras and some other of the wise men of Grecia, and that he held them for excellent men, but that they had a fault. So it must be confessed that a great part of the law moral is of that perfection whereunto the light of nature cannot aspire. How then is it that man is said to have, by the light and law of nature, some notions and conceits of virtue and vice, justice and wrong, good and evil? Thus, because the light of nature is used in two several senses, the one, that which springeth from reason, sense, induction, argument, according to the laws of heaven and earth; the other, that which is imprinted upon the spirit of man by an inward instinct, according to the law of conscience, which is a sparkle of the purity of his first estate, in which latter sense only he is participant of some light and discerning touching the perfection of the moral law. But how? Sufficient to check the vice, but not to inform the duty. So then the doctrine of religion, as well moral as mystical, is not to be attained but by inspiration and revelation from God. For the use notwithstanding of reason in spiritual things, and the latitude thereof, is very great and general, for it is not for nothing that the Apostle calleth religion our reasonable service of God, insomuch as the very ceremonies and figures of the old law were full of reason and signification, much more than the ceremonies of idolatry and magic, that are full of non-significance and absurd characters. But most specially the Christian faith, as in all things so in this, deserveth to be highly magnified, holding and preserving the golden mediocrity in this point between the law of the heathen and the law of Mahomet, which have embraced the two extremes. For the religion of the heathen had no constant belief or confession, but left all to the liberty of agent, and the religion of Mahomet on the other side interdicteth argument altogether, the one having the very face of error, and the other of imposture, whereas the faith doth both admit and reject disputation with difference. 5. The use of human reason in religion is of two sorts: the former, in the conception and apprehension of the mysteries of God to us revealed; the other, in the inferring and deriving of doctrine and direction thereupon. The former extendeth to the mysteries themselves, but how? By way of illustration, and not by way of argument. The latter consisteth indeed of probation and argument. In the former we see God vouchsafeth to descend to our capacity, in the expressing of his mysteries in sort as may be sensible unto us, and doth graft his revelations and holy doctrine upon the notions of our reason, and applieth his inspirations to open our understanding. The form of the key to the ward of the lock. For the latter there is allowed us a use of reason and argument, secondary and respective, although not original and absolute. For after the articles and principles of religion are placed and exempted from examination of reason, it is then permitted unto us to make derivations and inferences from, and according to the analogy of them, for our better direction. In nature this holdeth not, for both the principles are examinable by induction, though not by a medium or syllogism, and besides, those principles or first positions have no discordance with that reason which draweth down and deduceth the inferior positions. But yet it holdeth not in religion alone, but in many knowledges, both of greater and smaller nature, namely, wherein there are not only posita but placita, for in such there can be no use of absolute reason. We see it familiarly in games of wit as chess, or the like. The drafts and first laws of the game are positive, but how? Merely ad placitum, and not examinable by reason. But then how to direct our play thereupon with best advantage to win the game is artificial and rational. So in human laws there be many grounds and maxims which are placita juris, positive upon authority, and not upon reason, and therefore not to be disputed, but what is most just, not absolutely but relatively, and according to those maxims, that affordeth a long field of disputation. Such therefore is that secondary reason, which hath place in divinity, which is grounded upon the placets of God. 6. Here therefore I note this deficiency, that there hath not been, to my understanding, sufficiently inquired and handled the true limits and use of reason in spiritual things, as a kind of divine dialectic, which for that it is not done, it seemeth to me a thing usual, by pretext of true conceiving that which is revealed, to search and mine into that which is not revealed, and by pretext of enucleating inferences and contradictories, to examine that which is positive, the one sort falling into the error of Nicodemus, demanding to have things made more sensible than it pleaseth God to reveal them. Quamodo posit homo nasci cum sit senex, the other sort into the error of the disciples, which were scandalized at a show of contradiction. Quid est hoc quod dicit nobis, modicum et non videbitis me, et itrum modicum et videbitis me, and c. 7. Upon this I have insisted the more, in regard of the great and blessed use thereof. For this point well labored and defined of would in my judgment be an opiate to stay and bridle not only the vanity of curious speculations, wherewith the schools labor, but the fury of controversies, wherewith the church laboreth. For it cannot but open men's eyes to see that many controversies do merely pertain to that which is either not revealed or positive, and that many others do grow upon weak and obscure inferences or derivations, which latter sort, if men would revive the blessed style of that great doctor of the Gentiles, would be carried thus ego non dominus, and again, secundum concilium meum, in opinions and counsels, and not in positions and oppositions. But men are now over ready to usurp the style non ego sed dominus, and not so only, but to bind it with the thunder and denunciation of curses and anathemas, to the terror of those which have not sufficiently learned out of Solomon, that the causeless curse shall not come. 8. Divinity hath two principal parts, the matter informed or revealed, and the nature of the information or revelation. And with the latter we will begin, because it hath most coherence with that which we have now last handled. The nature of the information consisteth of three branches: the limits of the information, the sufficiency of the information, and the acquiring or obtaining the information. Unto the limits of the information belong these considerations: how far forth particular persons continue to be inspired, how far forth the Church is inspired, and how far forth reason may be used, the last point whereof I have noted as deficient. Unto the sufficiency of the information belong two considerations: what points of religion are fundamental, and what perfective, being matter of further building and perfection upon one and the same foundation. And again, how the gradations of light according to the dispensation of times are material to the sufficiency of belief. 9. Here again I may rather give it in advice than note it as deficient, that the points fundamental, and the points of further perfection only, ought to be with piety and wisdom distinguished, a subject tending to much like end as that I noted before. For, as that other were likely to abate the number of controversies, so this is likely to abate the heat of many of them. We see Moses, when he saw the Israelite and the Egyptian fight, he did not say, "Why strive you?" but drew his sword and slew the Egyptian. But when he saw the two Israelites fight, he said, "You are brethren, why strive you, if the point of doctrine be an Egyptian? It must be slain by the sword of the Spirit, and not reconciled, but if it be an Israelite, though in the wrong, then why strive you?" We see of the fundamental points, our Saviour penneth the league thus: "He that is not with us is against us." But of points not fundamental, thus: "He that is not against us is with us." So we see the coat of our Saviour was entire without seam, and so is the doctrine of the Scriptures in itself. But the garment of the Church was of divers colors and yet not divided. We see the chaff may and ought to be severed from the corn in the ear, but the tares may not be pulled up from the corn in the field. So as it is a thing of great use well to define what, and of what latitude, those points are which do make men mere aliens and disincorporate from the Church of God. 10. For the obtaining of the information, it resteth upon the true and sound interpretation of the Scriptures, which are the fountains of the water of life. The interpretations of the Scriptures are of two sorts: methodical and solute or at large. For this divine water, which excelleth so much that of Jacob's well, is drawn forth much in the same kind as natural water useth to be out of wells and fountains. Either it is first forced up into a cistern, and from thence fetched and derived for use, or else it is drawn and received in buckets and vessels immediately where it springeth. The former sort whereof, though it seem to be the more ready, yet, in my judgment, is more subject to corrupt. This is that method which hath exhibited unto us the scholastical divinity, whereby divinity hath been reduced into an art, as into a cistern, and the streams of doctrine or positions fetched and derived from thence. 11. In this men have sought three things: a summary brevity, a compacted strength, and a complete perfection, whereof the two first they fail to find, and the last they ought not to seek. For as to brevity, we see in all summary methods, while men purpose to abridge, they give cause to dilate. For the sum or abridgment by contraction becometh obscure, the obscurity requireth exposition, and the exposition is deduced into large commentaries, or into commonplaces and titles, which grow to be more vast than the original writings, whence the sum was at first extracted. So we see the volumes of the schoolmen are greater much than the first writings of the fathers, whence the master of the sentences made his sum or collection. So in like manner the volumes of the modern doctors of the civil law exceed those of the ancient jurisconsults, of which Tribonian compiled the digest. So as this course of sums and commentaries is that which doth infallibly make the body of sciences more immense in quantity, and more base in substance. 12. And for strength, it is true that knowledges reduced into exact methods have a show of strength, in that each part seemeth to support and sustain the other, but this is more satisfactory than substantial. Like unto buildings which stand by architecture and compaction, which are more subject to ruin than those that are built more strong in their several parts, though less compacted. But it is plain that the more you recede from your grounds, the weaker do you conclude. And as in nature, the more you remove yourself from particulars, the greater peril of error you do incur. So much more in divinity, the more you recede from the Scriptures by inferences and consequences, the more weak and dilute are your positions. 13. And as for perfection or completeness in divinity, it is not to be sought, which makes this course of artificial divinity the more suspect. For he that will reduce a knowledge into an art will make it round and uniform, but in divinity many things must be left abrupt. And concluded with this: O altitudo sapientiae et scientiae Dei, quam incomprehensibilia sunt jujucua ejus, et non investigabiles via ejus. So again the Apostle saith, ex part simis, and to have the form of a total, where there is but matter for a part, cannot be without supplies by supposition and presumption. And therefore I conclude that the true use of these sums and methods hath place in institutions or introductions preparatory unto knowledge. But in them, or by deducement from them, to handle the main body and substance of a knowledge is in all sciences prejudicial, and in divinity dangerous. 14. As to the interpretation of the Scriptures solute and at large, there have been divers kinds introduced and devised, some of them rather curious and unsafe than sober and warranted. Notwithstanding, thus much must be confessed, that the Scriptures, being given by inspiration and not by human reason, do differ from all other books in the author, which by consequence doth draw on